The email, a single sterile line, glowed on Elias's phone, a stark white slash against the funereal black of his suit. "We need to have a chat upon your return. Urgent." It was from Mr. Abernathy, his boss. Elias, standing under the forgiving shade of an ancient oak, the scent of damp earth and lilies heavy in the air, felt a cold dread snake up his spine, a feeling utterly alien to the raw, cavernous grief that had taken up residence in his chest. His mother was gone. The world had already tilted on its axis. This felt like a new, malevolent wobble. He had, of course, informed Abernathy of his mother's sudden passing. The man had offered his condolences, a string of practiced hollow words that felt like pebbles hitting a coffin. "Take the time you need, son. Family first." 3 days, Elias had requested. 3 days to navigate the labyrinth of funeral arrangements, to hold his father's trembling hands, to simply breathe in the echoing silence of his childhood home. Abernathy had approved it without a second thought, a casual flick of his digital pen on the leave application. The 3 days were a blur of hushed conversations, shared tears, and the quiet, crushing weight of finality. He'd returned to his small apartment, the silence there a different, more personal kind of void. He had expected to return to work the next day, to the familiar rhythm of spreadsheets and deadlines, a welcome, if mundane, distraction. But then came the chat. The office, usually a symphony of clacking keyboards and ringing phones, felt muted, the air thick with an unspoken tension. Elias's colleagues, people he'd shared lunches and inside jokes with, offered him sympathetic glances, their eyes darting away as Abernathy's office door loomed into view. He knocked, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet hum. "Come in, Elias." Abernathy, a man whose smile never quite reached his eyes, was perched on the edge of his mahogany desk, a caricature of relaxed authority. He was impeccably dressed, as always, his silver hair coiffed to perfection. He gestured to the chair opposite him, a leather monstrosity that always made Elias feel small. "First off," Abernathy began, his voice a low, confidential murmur, "my deepest condolences once again. A terrible business." Elias mumbled his thanks, his gaze fixed on a point just over Abernathy's shoulder. "Now, Elias," Abernathy's tone shifted, the faux sympathy evaporating like morning mist. "We have a bit of a situation." He picked up a file from his desk, its crisp manila a stark contrast to the crumpled tissues in Elias's pocket. "The Henderson Project. You know how crucial this quarter is for us." Elias's stomach clenched. The Henderson Project was his baby, a complex, multi-layered account he'd been nurturing for months. "Of course, sir. I was planning on diving right back in." Abernathy gave a small, humorless laugh. "That's the thing, Elias. While you were away, we had to make some adjustments. Deadlines, you understand. We can't afford any slippage." The words hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Elias felt a prickle of unease. "I understand, sir. I'm ready to work overtime, whatever it takes to catch up." "It's not about catching up, Elias." Abernathy's eyes, cold and gray as a winter sky, finally met his. "It's about commitment, about being a team player. We needed all hands on deck this week." The Henderson team felt unsupported. Abernathy had a knack for this, for twisting words into weapons, for making you feel like a failure for things beyond your control. Before his mother's illness, Elias had seen it happen to others. The subtle digs in meetings, the impossible deadlines, the way he'd pit colleagues against each other in a Darwinian struggle for his approval. Elias had always kept his head down, his work impeccable, a silent, unwilling participant in the toxic ecosystem Abernathy had cultivated. He'd once seen Abernathy praise a colleague, a young, ambitious woman named Sarah, for working through a bout of pneumonia. "That's dedication," he'd boomed in a team meeting, a thinly veiled warning to the rest of them. Sarah had burned out 6 months later, her resignation a quiet, almost invisible act of defiance. Elias's grief, a raw, gaping wound, was now being prodded by a man who saw vulnerability as a weakness, a liability. "Sir," Elias began, his voice trembling slightly, "I was at my mother's funeral." Abernathy held up a hand, a gesture of feigned patience. "And we respect that, Elias. We do, but the business doesn't stop for personal matters. We have a responsibility to our clients, to our shareholders." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I had to make a tough decision. I've reassigned the Henderson project to Mark." Mark, ambitious, sycophantic Mark, who had been circling the Henderson account like a vulture for weeks. The dread in Elias's gut coalesced into a cold, hard knot of anger. "You're taking me off the project?" Elias's voice was barely a whisper. "It's not a punishment, Elias," Abernathy said, his tone infuriatingly reasonable. "It's a strategic move. We need someone who can give it their undivided attention right now, and frankly, with everything you're going through, I'm not sure you're in the right headspace." The patronizing concern was more insulting than an outright dismissal. He was being deemed unfit, his grief a disqualifying stain on his professional record. He thought of the long nights he'd poured into the Henderson project, the weekends sacrificed, the small personal triumphs he'd celebrated in the quiet of his apartment. All of it erased in a single callous conversation. He wanted to scream, to unleash the torrent of anger and grief that was threatening to consume him. He wanted to tell Abernathy about the hollow ache in his chest, about the way the world seemed to have lost its color. He wanted to tell him that his grief wasn't a weakness, but a testament to the love he had for his mother. But the words wouldn't come. He was trapped in the suffocating stillness of Abernathy's office, the air thick with the man's smug self-assurance. The next few hours passed in a daze. Elias packed his desk, the small personal items, a framed photo of his mother, a chipped coffee mug, a collection of well-worn novels, feeling like relics from a past life. His colleagues offered him awkward, furtive goodbyes, their eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. They knew what had happened. They knew that in Abernathy's kingdom, loyalty was a one-way street. The walk home was a blur of city sounds, the screech of tires, the wail of a distant siren, all of it muffled by the roaring in his ears. He unlocked the door to his apartment, and the silence rushed in to greet him, a familiar, yet newly menacing presence. The first few days were a descent into a gray, featureless landscape of grief and rage. He'd wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, the image of Abernathy's smug face seared into his mind. The betrayal was a fresh wound, layered on top of the already profound loss of his mother. It felt personal, a deliberate, cruel blow, delivered at his most vulnerable moment. He replayed their conversation over and over, dissecting every word, every nuance. He saw the subtle manipulations, the gaslighting, the way Abernathy had used his grief as a weapon against him. He'd been a pawn in a game he didn't even know he was playing. One rainy afternoon, as he sat staring at the droplets chasing each other down his window pane, a flicker of something new sparked within him. It was a small, fragile thing, a tiny ember of defiance in the ashes of his despair. He thought of his mother, a woman of quiet strength and unshakable integrity. She had taught him the importance of standing up for himself, of not letting bullies dim his light. He opened his laptop, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He started to write, not a letter of complaint, not a plea for his job back, but something else entirely. He wrote about his mother, about her kindness, her laughter, her unwavering love. He wrote about the gut-wrenching pain of losing her, the way it had hollowed him out, leaving him raw and exposed. And then he wrote about Abernathy. He wrote about the toxic culture of fear and intimidation he had cultivated, the way he preyed on the vulnerabilities of his employees, the way he had turned a place of work into a battlefield. He wrote about the betrayal, not as a victim, but as a witness. He posted it on a professional networking site, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. He didn't name Abernathy or the company, but the details were specific enough to be recognizable to anyone who had worked there. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Messages flooded his inbox from former colleagues, people who had left the company years ago, all sharing similar stories of abuse and manipulation. They spoke of a culture of fear, of a boss who thrived on the insecurities of his employees. They thanked him for his courage, for giving a voice to their own unspoken pain. A few days later, he received a call from a journalist who had seen his post. She wanted to do a story on toxic workplace cultures, on the hidden epidemic of workplace abuse. He hesitated at first, the fear of reprisal still a cold knot in his stomach. But then he thought of his mother and the quiet strength she had instilled in him. He agreed to the interview. He spoke his truth, not with anger, but with a quiet, resolute dignity. He spoke not just for himself, but for all the others who had been silenced, for all the others who had been made to feel small and insignificant. The article was published a week later, a searing indictment of the kind of leadership that valued profits over people, power over compassion. It didn't name Abernathy, but the ripples were felt throughout the industry. Whispers turned into conversations, and conversations into investigations. Elias never went back to that world of spreadsheets and deadlines. The experience had changed him, had stripped him down to his core and forced him to rebuild himself from the ground up. He started a small consulting business, helping companies create healthier, more supportive work environments. He used his own pain as a catalyst for change, his own story as a beacon of hope for others. He still grieved for his mother, a dull, constant ache that would likely never fully disappear. But now, intertwined with the grief, was a sense of purpose, a newfound strength he had discovered in the depths of his despair. He had lost his job, but he had found his voice. And in the quiet moments, when the silence threatened to overwhelm him, he would remember the feel of his mother's hand in his, and the quiet, unwavering belief she had always had in him. He had been unbecoming, stripped of his title, his security, his sense of self. But in that unbecoming, he had, for the first time in a long time, truly become himself.